The morning sun streamed through the windows of JFK Airport's Terminal 8 as passengers lined up for the 9:45 a.m. flight to Los Angeles. Among them stood Mrs. Thompson, her crisp navy blue uniform perfectly pressed, her golden wings pin gleaming under the fluorescent lights. After 20 years as a flight attendant, she had developed what she considered a sixth sense about passengers, or so she thought. The boarding process began smoothly enough. Business travelers in suits tapped away on their phones, families caroled excited children, and the usual mix of tourists chatted about their upcoming California adventures. Mrs. Thompson stood at the aircraft door, greeting passengers with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning," a deep, gentle voice said. Mrs. Thompson looked up to find an older gentleman in a military jacket adorned with service pins. Mr. Wilson, a retired Air Force colonel, stood tall despite his 60-plus years, his kind eyes meeting hers as he handed over his boarding pass. Something shifted in Mrs. Thompson's expression. She studied the first-class ticket in her hands longer than necessary, glancing between it and Mr. Wilson several times. "Are you sure you're in first class?" she asked, her tone carrying an edge that made nearby passengers pause. "Yes, ma'am," Mr. Wilson replied patiently, pulling out his military ID. "I fly first class quite often." Mrs. Thompson's lips tightened. "Let me verify this again," she said, despite having already scanned his boarding pass. The line began to back up as she made a show of double-checking his seat assignment. A younger passenger behind Mr. Wilson shifted uncomfortably. "Is there a problem?" he asked, noticing how the veteran was being treated differently from the previous passengers. "Just doing my job," Mrs. Thompson replied curtly, finally stepping aside to let Mr. Wilson board. But she wasn't done. Throughout the boarding process, she kept glancing towards seat 2A, where Mr. Wilson sat quietly reading a book. As other passengers settled in, Mrs. Thompson made several unnecessary passes by his seat. She checked his seatbelt when she hadn't checked anyone else's. She questioned whether his carry-on bag would fit in the overhead compartment, despite it being a standard-sized briefcase. Other passengers began to notice. A woman across the aisle exchanged concerned looks with her husband. A teenage girl a few rows back pulled out her phone, keeping it low but pointed toward the ongoing interaction. The tension reached its peak when Mr. Wilson pressed his call button. He hadn't asked for anything during the entire boarding process, but now, as the cabin lights dimmed for takeoff, he needed a simple blanket. The air conditioning was making the cabin quite chilly. Mrs. Thompson's response was immediate and sharp. "Sir, we're about to take off. You'll need to wait." Her voice carried through the quiet cabin, making several passengers turn their heads. "I understand," Mr. Wilson replied calmly. "I just appreciate a blanket when it's convenient." "I'll need to see your boarding pass again," Mrs. Thompson announced loudly, causing a ripple of murmurs through the first-class cabin. "Just to verify your seat assignment." The absurdity of the request, this would be the third time she checked his ticket, wasn't lost on anyone. Several phones were now recording discreetly. A businessman in row 3 cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before him. Yet through it all, Mr. Wilson maintained his composure. He reached for his boarding pass once more, hands steady despite the humiliation. His military training was evident in his measured responses and dignified bearing, making Mrs. Thompson's behavior appear even more inappropriate by contrast. As the videos would later show, it was this moment, this third request for a boarding pass from a decorated veteran who had done nothing wrong, that would mark the beginning of Mrs. Thompson's downfall. She didn't know it yet, but her actions were about to set in motion a chain of events that would change not just her life, but the lives of many others. Little did she realize that among the passengers recording this incident was someone with millions of social media followers, someone who would make sure this story wouldn't stay confined to Flight 2257. And she certainly didn't know that Mr. Wilson's son would turn out to be someone who would play a crucial role in her family's future. The plane took off into the morning sky, carrying with it a powder keg of tension that was set to explode. Mrs. Thompson continued her duties, unaware that in less than 24 hours, this routine flight would become national news, and her world would be turned upside down in ways she never could have imagined. 2 hours into the flight to Los Angeles, the first-class cabin had settled into its usual routine. Laptops hummed, magazines rustled, and the soft drone of the engines created a peaceful backdrop. But that peace was about to shatter. Mr. Wilson had dozed off slightly, his book resting in his lap, when the air conditioning kicked into high gear. The chill made him stir, and once again he pressed the call button, hoping this time he might receive the blanket he'd requested earlier. Mrs. Thompson appeared, her steps quick and purposeful. "Yes?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of irritation that wasn't lost on the surrounding passengers. "I apologize for bothering you again," Mr. Wilson said softly, "but I'm still quite cold. Would it be possible to get that blanket now?" Something in Mrs. Thompson's expression hardened. "I'll need to check if we have any left in first class," she replied, despite the clearly visible stack of blankets in the overhead compartment right above them. A young woman in row 4, a social media influencer known for her travel content, had been watching the situation unfold since takeoff. She couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Excuse me," she called out, her phone already recording, "there are blankets right there in the bin. I can see them." Mrs. Thompson spun around, her professional demeanor cracking. "Ma'am, please don't interfere. I'm handling this situation." "What situation?" Another passenger chimed in, a middle-aged businessman who'd been pretending to work on his laptop while watching everything. "The gentleman just wants a blanket." The cabin grew tense as more passengers began paying attention. Mrs. Thompson, feeling cornered, made a critical error in judgment. She reached up, opened the bin, and deliberately passed over the blankets to shuffle through other items. "I'm sorry, sir," she announced loudly, "but it seems all our premium blankets have been claimed. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in economy, where there might be some standard blankets available." The suggestion that a first-class passenger should move to economy for a blanket was so outrageous that several passengers gasped. Phones emerged from all directions now, no longer hiding their recording. A flight attendant from economy, sensing the growing tension, hurried forward. She was younger, maybe in her mid-20s, and the concern on her face was genuine. "Mrs. T," she whispered, trying to defuse the situation, "I can grab a blanket." "Return to your section," Mrs. Thompson snapped, causing her younger colleague to step back in surprise. Mr. Wilson, who had remained remarkably composed throughout the exchange, slowly stood up. At his full height, his military bearing was impossible to miss. The medals on his jacket caught the cabin lights, and for a moment, the entire first-class section fell silent. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady and dignified, "I've served this country for over 30 years. I've flown in aircraft under much worse conditions than this. I can manage without a blanket. But I would like your name and employee number, please." Mrs. Thompson's face flushed. "Are you threatening me?" The young influencer stood up now, her phone capturing everything. "He's not threatening you. He's asking for information he's entitled to as a passenger. We've all watched you discriminate against him since boarding." "This is ridiculous," Mrs. Thompson declared, her voice rising. "I'm simply following protocol." "What protocol?" the businessman interrupted. "The protocol of checking his ticket 3 times, the protocol of ignoring his simple request for a blanket, the protocol of suggesting a first-class passenger move to economy. Please enlighten us." Other passengers began sharing their observations. "I've been watching this since we boarded. She didn't check anyone else's ticket multiple times. I got my blanket as soon as I asked." The younger flight attendant had returned with her supervisor, who quickly assessed the situation. The supervisor, looking grave, pulled Mrs. Thompson aside for a quiet but intense conversation. Mr. Wilson remained standing, his dignity intact despite the humiliation he'd endured. A few passengers came forward to offer their contact information as witnesses, including the influencer, who had already begun editing her video. "Sir," the supervisor said, approaching Mr. Wilson, "I want to personally apologize for your experience. I assure you this will be addressed immediately. Please, let me get you that blanket." As the supervisor retrieved a blanket from the very bin Mrs. Thompson had claimed was empty, the impact of what had just transpired began to sink in. The younger passengers were already sharing the video online through the plane's Wi-Fi. The business travelers were sending emails to their corporate travel departments. And Mrs. Thompson, now realizing the gravity of her actions, stood rigid in the galley, watching her 20-year career crumble before her eyes. What she didn't know What none of them knew was that this confrontation would soon explode far beyond the confines of Flight 2257. By the time they landed in Los Angeles, the video would be viral, and a revelation about Mr. Wilson's family would turn this incident into something far more personal than Mrs. Thompson could ever have imagined. The wheels of Flight 2257 had barely touched down at LAX when Mrs. Thompson's phone started buzzing uncontrollably. Text messages, missed calls, and social media notifications flooded her screen. Her hands trembled as she unlocked her phone in the crew rest area, and her heart sank at what she saw. The video was everywhere. 3 different angles of the blanket incident had gone viral, with millions of views climbing by the minute. The young influencer's version, professionally edited with captions and context, was already trending at #1. Comments poured in by the thousands. Watch how she treats this American hero. 20 years as a flight attendant, and this is how she acts. Look at those medals on his jacket. This man served our country. As she scrolled through the comments, her supervisor appeared at the door. The chief pilot wants to see you immediately, she said quietly, and corporate is on the line. The next few hours passed in a blur. In a small office at LAX, Mrs. Thompson sat across from airline executives who had been hastily summoned. Their faces were grim as they played the videos on a large screen, each angle showing her behavior in devastating clarity. "Can you explain your actions?" the head of flight services asked, his voice heavy with disappointment. Mrs. Thompson opened her mouth, but no words came out. How could she explain something she was only now beginning to understand about herself? Meanwhile, the story was taking on a life of its own. News vans gathered outside the airport. Aviation blogs were digging into her service record. But it was the revelation about Mr. Wilson that truly changed everything. A popular military community page had identified him, Colonel Richard Wilson, retired Air Force veteran with over 3 decades of distinguished service. His missions had saved countless lives. He'd received medals for valor under fire. The page shared photos of him receiving awards, leading humanitarian missions, and most devastatingly, visiting wounded soldiers in hospitals. The contrast between his lifetime of service and how she treated him hit Mrs. Thompson like a physical blow. But there was more to come. Back at home that evening, Mrs. Thompson sat in her dark living room, illuminated only by her laptop screen. Her daughter found her there, still in her uniform, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, what's wrong?" Mrs. Thompson couldn't speak. On her screen was an email from the airline's HR department notifying her of immediate administrative leave pending investigation. Below that was another email, this one from her healthcare provider. Her daughter's upcoming heart surgery had been flagged for review due to a potential conflict of interest with the assigned surgical team. She didn't understand the connection yet, but her stomach churned with an inexplicable sense of dread. Her phone rang. Her union representative. "Listen," he said without preamble, "this is bad. The videos have over 10 million views combined. Colonel Wilson's service record is impeccable. And," he paused, "you need to know who his son is." Before he could continue, Mrs. Thompson's daughter called out from the kitchen, "Mom, you're on TV." The evening news was running the story. They showed the videos, interviewed aviation experts about passenger rights, and discussed the airline's history with similar incidents. But it was the last segment that made Mrs. Thompson's world stop spinning. In a related development, the news anchor said, "We've learned that Colonel Wilson's son is the renowned Dr. Wilson, newly appointed chief of surgery at Central Heart Institute, where he's revolutionized pediatric cardiac procedures." The remote slipped from Mrs. Thompson's hand. The Central Heart Institute, that's where her daughter was scheduled for surgery next month. Dr. Wilson was supposed to be her surgeon. Her phone started ringing again. More messages poured in, but Mrs. Thompson couldn't move. In one horrible moment of clarity, she realized how a single act of prejudice had set off a chain reaction that now threatened not just her career, but her daughter's future. Outside, reporters had already found her house. Camera lights illuminated her front yard. Social media was discovering her identity, sharing her previous flights, looking for patterns. 20 years of service, hundreds of thousands of passengers served, and it had all come down to this one terrible day. As she finally broke down in her daughter's arms, Mrs. Thompson understood that this was more than just a viral video or a PR disaster. This was about facing the consequences of unconscious bias, about confronting uncomfortable truths about herself, and about learning that every interaction, every moment of prejudice, every snap judgment could have far-reaching consequences she never could have imagined. And somewhere across the city, in a quiet hospital office, Dr. Wilson was looking at his own father's viral video, facing an impossible decision about an upcoming surgery that would force him to choose between professional ethics and personal pain. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the airline's corporate headquarters as Mrs. Thompson sat nervously in the waiting area. Her hands clutched a folder containing her service record, letters of recommendation, and a hastily written apology statement. After a sleepless night, she'd been summoned for an emergency meeting with the airline's executive team. The wall-mounted TV played the morning news on mute, but she could read the captions. Airline controversy continues. Veteran mistreatment video reaches 15 million views. Below that, a ticker showed the airline's stock price dropping. Mrs. Thompson, a serious-looking woman in a suit, appeared. "They're ready for you." The conference room felt enormous, with 8 executives seated around a polished table. Their faces were grave as she took her seat. The chief of operations spoke first. "Before we begin, have you seen the latest developments?" Mrs. Thompson shook her head. She turned off her phone after midnight, unable to bear more notifications. He slid a tablet across the table. On it was a press release from Central Heart Institute. Her heart stopped as she read the headline. Dr. Wilson requests recusal from upcoming surgeries due to ethical concerns. Dr. Wilson, the HR director, explained gently, has identified several patients whose families were involved in yesterday's incident. He feels he cannot proceed with their surgeries due to potential conflicts of interest. The room spun. Mrs. Thompson's daughter's surgery was just weeks away. It had taken months to get an appointment with Dr. Wilson, known for his groundbreaking techniques in pediatric heart surgery. He was one of only 3 surgeons in the country qualified to perform the specific procedure her daughter needed. I didn't know," she whispered. "The situation has become more complex than a simple customer service incident," the legal director added. "Colonel Wilson's military record is exceptional. His son, Dr. Wilson, is a leading figure in pediatric cardiac surgery. The public response has been overwhelming. They showed her more. Social media campaigns calling for her termination, veterans groups planning protests, medical ethics boards weighing in on Dr. Wilson's decision. Her actions had created a ripple effect far beyond anything she could have imagined. The meeting continued, but Mrs. Thompson barely heard the words. Her mind was stuck on her daughter's face, on the calendar marking surgery day, on the hopes they placed in Dr. Wilson's skilled hands. Later that afternoon, she sat in her car in the parking garage, finally turning on her phone. Among the hundreds of notifications was an email from Central Heart Institute. With trembling fingers, she opened it. The message was brief but devastating. Due to Dr. Wilson's recusal, her daughter's surgery would need to be rescheduled with another surgeon. The waiting list for other qualified surgeons was 8 months long. Tears blurred her vision as reality sank in. Her bias, her unfair treatment of a stranger, had now put her own child's life at risk. The weight of her actions crushed down on her shoulders. A knock on her car window made her jump. It was the young flight attendant from the incident flight. "I saw your car," she said softly. "Are you okay?" Mrs. Thompson broke down, sharing everything: the surgery, the connection, the horrible irony of it all. The young attendant listened without judgment. "You know," she said finally, "my grandfather was a lot like Colonel Wilson. A decorated veteran who faced discrimination his whole life. But he always said something that stuck with me. Hate shows you who you don't want to be. Love shows you who you can become." As they talked, Mrs. Thompson's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her union representative. Dr. Wilson had agreed to a meeting with Hospital Ethics Board to discuss the cases he'd recused himself from. There might be a chance, a small one, to make things right. The young attendant squeezed her hand. "Maybe this is your opportunity to show who you can become." In her mind, Mrs. Thompson saw it all clearly now. Colonel Wilson's dignified bearing despite her treatment, his son's ethical struggle, her own daughter's future hanging in the balance. The universe had created a connection she never could have anticipated, forcing her to face the consequences of her prejudices in the most personal way possible. As she drove home, past news vans still camped outside her house, she began to form a plan. If there was any chance of making this right, of securing her daughter's future and becoming someone better in the process, she had to take it. The question was, would the Wilsons, father and son, be willing to listen? The news came through a simple email. Your employment with the airline has been terminated, effective immediately. Mrs. Thompson read it 3 times, sitting at her kitchen table in the early morning light. Though she'd expected it, the finality still hit hard. Her daughter came downstairs, school backpack in hand, and immediately sensed something was wrong. Mom. Just work stuff, honey. Mrs. Thompson tried to smile. Ready for school? But her daughter, wise beyond her 15 years, set down her bag. I saw the videos, Mom. Everyone at school has. She paused, touching the scar on her chest from her previous heart operations. Is this why Dr. Wilson cancelled my surgery? The direct question, delivered with such innocence, broke something in Mrs. Thompson. For days, she'd been dealing with the professional consequences. The termination, the media coverage, the public shame. But facing her daughter, seeing the fear and confusion in her eyes, brought the personal cost into sharp focus. I made a terrible mistake, she admitted, her voice cracking. I treated someone unfairly because I didn't stop to think about my own prejudices. And now I might not get my surgery, her daughter finished quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, a news van that had been stationed there for days started its engine, likely heading off for fresh footage. Mrs. Thompson's phone buzzed with another call from her union representative, but she ignored it. Instead, she opened her laptop and did something she'd been avoiding. She watched the full, unedited footage of her interaction with Colonel Wilson. Without the adrenaline of the moment, without the defensive walls she'd built, she saw herself clearly for the first time. The subtle dismissiveness in her tone, the unnecessary questioning, the deliberate humiliation, the absolute certainty that she was right. Her daughter watched with her, neither speaking. When it ended, she simply asked, "Why?" That single word carried the weight of generations of prejudice, of unconscious bias, of learned behaviors so deeply ingrained they seemed normal until confronted with their consequences. Later that day, Mrs. Thompson attended her first bias awareness workshop at the local community center. She'd found it online, hoping it might be a start toward understanding herself better. The facilitator, a retired teacher, asked everyone to share what brought them there. When Mrs. Thompson's turn came, she spoke honestly about the incident, her voice shaking. She expected judgment, maybe even hostility. Instead, she found something unexpected, people willing to listen, to share their own stories of bias, both experienced and perpetrated. The hardest part, one participant said, is admitting these biases exist within us. The second hardest part is doing something about it. That evening, Mrs. Thompson received another email, this one from the hospital ethics board. Dr. Wilson had agreed to a review of his recusal decision, but with conditions. He wanted to meet with her first, along with his father, Colonel Wilson. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. As she marked it on her calendar, her daughter asked, "Are you scared?" Terrified, Mrs. Thompson admitted, but sometimes being scared is part of making things right. She spent the next few days preparing. Not with speeches or excuses, but with honest self-reflection. She read about implicit bias, watched documentaries about military veterans' experiences, and most importantly, listened to stories from people who had faced discrimination. Her daughter's cardiologist called with news of other surgical options, but none as promising as Dr. Wilson's pioneering technique. The 8-month waiting list for other specialists loomed like a shadow over their lives. One night, unable to sleep, Mrs. Thompson found her old flight attendant training materials. 20 years of service, and she'd always prided herself on being professional, on treating everyone equally. Now she wondered how many other passengers she'd treated differently without even realizing it. The local news ran a feature on Colonel Wilson's military career. Watching it, Mrs. Thompson learned about his missions providing medical aid in disaster zones, his work mentoring young officers, his dedication to service long after retirement. The man she humiliated had spent his life helping others. As the day of the meeting approached, Mrs. Thompson's daughter gave her a card she'd made. Inside was a simple message: "People can change, Mom. I believe in you." Looking at her daughter's hopeful face, Mrs. Thompson realized this wasn't just about saving her job or securing the surgery. It was about breaking a cycle, about becoming someone her daughter could be proud of, about facing hard truths and doing the work to change. The question was, would Colonel Wilson and his son see her effort as genuine, or would her moment of prejudice define her forever in their eyes? The answer would come soon, and it would change more than just her future. It would determine her daughter's chance at a healthy life. The hospital's conference room felt smaller than it actually was. Mrs. Thompson arrived 20 minutes early, her hands clutching a leather portfolio containing documentation from her bias training sessions and volunteer work at the local veteran center. Her daughter had insisted on coming for support but waited outside. Through the glass walls, she could see medical staff walking past, some glancing in her direction with recognition. The video had made her face familiar, though not in the way anyone would want. At exactly 2 p.m., the door opened. Colonel Wilson entered first, still carrying himself with that same military bearing she remembered from the flight. Behind him came his son, Dr. Wilson, whose resemblance to his father was striking, the same steady gaze, the same quiet dignity. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Mrs. Thompson said softly, her voice trembling slightly. Dr. Wilson nodded professionally and took his seat. Colonel Wilson sat beside him, his expression unreadable. The hospital's ethics board representative completed their small group, taking position at the head of the table. Before we discussed the medical situation, Colonel Wilson spoke first, his voice even. "I'd like to hear your thoughts about what happened that day." Mrs. Thompson had rehearsed this moment countless times, but now, facing them directly, prepared words felt inadequate. Instead, she spoke from her heart. "I've spent every day since then watching that video, analyzing my actions, and facing hard truths about myself," she began. "I treated you with suspicion and disrespect, not because of anything you did, but because of prejudices I didn't even realize I carried." She opened her portfolio not to show her certificates, but to share something else, a photograph. "This is my daughter outside this hospital, age 6, after her first heart surgery. Dr. Wilson, your innovative procedure is her best hope for a normal life. The irony that my treatment of your father might deny her that chance." Her voice cracked. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Wilson leaned forward, "my ethical concerns aren't about punishment. They're about ensuring I can provide the best possible care without personal bias affecting my judgment in either direction." Colonel Wilson studied her for a long moment. "Tell me about what you've been doing since the incident." She told them about the bias awareness workshops, how she'd started as a reluctant participant but had become deeply involved in the discussions. She described her volunteer work at the Veterans Center, where she'd heard stories that opened her eyes to the everyday challenges veterans faced. Last week, she continued, a veteran at the center shared how he'd been treated with suspicion at a restaurant, despite wearing his service medals. As he told his story, "I saw myself in those who had judged him. It was uncomfortable, but necessary." Dr. Wilson exchanged a glance with his father. "You mentioned your daughter is outside." Mrs. Thompson nodded. "Would you mind if she joined us?" When her daughter entered, the atmosphere in the room shifted. She walked straight to Colonel Wilson and Dr. Wilson. "Sir," she addressed the colonel, "I saw how my mom treated you on that flight. It was wrong. But I also saw how she's been trying to change. She's not the same person she was that day." The colonel's expression softened slightly. "Young lady, how long have you been waiting for this surgery?" 3 years, she replied. "We tried other treatments, but Dr. Wilson's procedure is different. It could let me play soccer again." Dr. Wilson pulled out his tablet, reviewing her medical files. "The timing is critical in cases like yours," he noted. "Waiting another 8 months for a different surgeon could complicate things." Mrs. Thompson felt hope stir for the first time in weeks. "I know I have no right to ask anything of either of you. What I did was inexcusable, but my daughter shouldn't have to pay for my mistakes." Colonel Wilson stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the hospital grounds. After a long moment, he turned back to the room. "Throughout my military career, I encountered prejudice in many forms," he said quietly. Some people never acknowledged their bias. Others defended it. Very few faced it honestly and worked to change. The question isn't just about what happened that day, it's about what happens next. He looked at his son. The decision is yours as her doctor. But as someone who's seen both the worst and best in people, I believe genuine change is possible when someone is truly willing to do the work. Dr. Wilson studied his father's face, then turned to Mrs. Thompson and her daughter. The next words he spoke would either offer hope or confirm their fears, and the weight of that moment hung in the air between them all. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of Central Heart Institute's auditorium. Mrs. Thompson stood at the podium, facing a room full of airline staff attending a mandatory training session. Her daughter sat in the front row, her chest now bearing a fresh surgical scar, but her smile brighter than ever. "Many of you know me from the viral video," she began, her voice steady. "Today, I want to tell you what happened after those cameras stopped rolling." The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. In the back, she noticed Colonel Wilson and Dr. Wilson quietly entering, taking seats near the door. "Dr. Wilson did perform my daughter's surgery," she continued. "He chose to put aside personal feelings and honor his medical oath. But he had one condition, that I commit to helping others learn from my mistakes." She clicked to the next slide, showing the flight video. It was still hard to watch, but now it served a purpose. "That day, I thought I was just doing my job. I didn't see my actions as discriminatory because I'd never examined my own biases. But what I did went beyond poor customer service. It revealed prejudices I didn't even know I carried." In the audience, several flight attendants nodded, perhaps recognizing similar moments from their own experiences. The real story isn't about that viral video, it's about what happened next. She gestured to her daughter. "While my little girl was recovering from surgery, I was recovering too, from years of unconscious bias that had clouded my judgment." She shared how she continued her work at the Veterans Center even after her daughter's successful surgery. How Colonel Wilson had eventually become a mentor there, helping her develop training programs for airline staff about treating all passengers with dignity. "Last week," she smiled, "I received a message from that young influencer who recorded the original video. She wanted to do a follow-up story about transformation and redemption, but more importantly, she wanted to highlight the incredible grace shown by Colonel Wilson and his son." The colonel stood up, walking to join her at the podium. His presence still commanded respect, but now it was tinged with warmth. "Mrs. Thompson's story," he addressed the room, "is about more than one incident on one flight. It's about the choice we all have, to either defend our biases or confront them honestly." Dr. Wilson joined them next, adding his medical perspective. "As a surgeon, I deal with life and death decisions every day. But some of the most important healing happens in moments like these, when people choose to grow and change." Mrs. Thompson's daughter came forward then, standing between her mother and the two men who had helped transform a moment of shame into an opportunity for growth. "My surgery was successful," she told the audience, "not just because of Dr. Wilson's skilled hands, but because of his compassionate heart. And my mom's recovery, from her own prejudices, was successful because Colonel Wilson chose to guide rather than condemn." The training session evolved into a candid discussion about unconscious bias in the airline industry. Flight attendants shared their own experiences, both as witnesses and, sometimes, unwitting perpetrators of discrimination. Afterward, in the hospital cafeteria, Mrs. Thompson sat with Colonel Wilson and his son. Her daughter was showing them videos of her first soccer practice since the surgery. Sometimes, Colonel Wilson mused, watching the young girl's joyful play, "Our worst moments can lead to our best transformations." Dr. Wilson nodded. "As a doctor, I've learned that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about growing stronger at the broken places." Mrs. Thompson looked at her daughter, then at these two men who had every right to reject her but chose to help her instead. "The hardest part," she reflected, "wasn't losing my job or facing public shame. It was confronting the truth about myself. But that truth set me free to become someone better." Later that evening, as she and her daughter drove home, they'd passed the airport where it had all begun. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of hope. "Mom," her daughter said, "remember when you used to say everything happens for a reason?" Mrs. Thompson nodded. "Maybe this happened so you could help other people change too." Looking at her daughter, healthy and wise beyond her years, Mrs. Thompson realized that sometimes life's harshest lessons come wrapped in opportunities for grace. Her story wasn't just about confronting bias. It was about the remarkable capacity of the human heart to learn, to heal, and to grow. The next morning, she would wake up early to prepare for another training session. But tonight, she was simply grateful for second chances, for the kindness of those she had wronged, and for the possibility that her story might help others examine their own hearts and choose a better way forward.